Brought to you by the United States Marine Corps.
Hey everyone, and welcome in to another SCPI Southern Section Laxcast. I'm Sarah Chafee. This is our lead analyst, Jim Loftus of MaxLax LA, MaxLax OC, and MaxLax SD. And they can find you guys at Jim.
Oh, we're on the web at maxlaxoc.com. You can find us on Twitter. You can find us on Facebook. We're pretty easy to find. Google knows where we are.
Google knows everything. Alrighty, so we're going to jump right into it because we do have some things to talk about. We're already in week 5, so kind of crazy. Things are just kind of speeding by, but what we'll do is our usual order of business. We'll go through our top 10s. We'll talk a little bit about the week last week, and then we'll preview this upcoming week. So, Jim, let's start it off with our boys' top 10 this week from this last week. So we'll start at number 10. We have Oaks Christian, 9 San Clemente, 8 Westlake, 7 Chaminade, 6 Harvard Westlake, 5 Palos Verdes, 4 Tesoro, 3 Loyola, 2 St. Margaret's Episcopal, and number 1, still holding it down, is Foothill. So we do have a few teams on the bubble, and then we do, let's talk a little bit about the top 10. We'll break it down. Loyola had a really big game last night, Jim. So first, can you talk a little bit about that game, and then we can kind of mention who sits on the bubble and why, because I see that Santa Margarita is close, but they didn't make it in the top 10 this week. So first, can you kind of start off with Loyola's big game and talk a little bit about that, break that down for everyone?
Sure. So Loyola actually has a really big week this week, and we can talk about the rest of it later. But last night they were down in San Diego and played Coronado, which is a fairly traditional powerhouse down there. In fact, Coronado had beaten St. Ignatius of San Francisco earlier this year, and St. Ignatius is one of the few teams that's beaten Loyola early this year. So this was a good one to check out. And Coronado, I think, led that one 4-3 at halftime. But Loyola came charging back in the second half and ended up winning 13-7. So a pretty dominant second half victory, and one that you really have to give probably more to the defense, because that defense has only allowed double-digit goals once, and that was in the opener to Foothill that they lost in overtime. Since then, I don't think they've allowed an opponent to get to 9 goals on them, and so they held Coronado to 7, won that one. Really, a strong out-of-section game for them, and on another impressive mark on their resume.
Absolutely, and Foothill, they did travel up north, correct, to the Northern California area. What were your biggest takeaways from their week last week?
Well, Foothill had a pretty interesting trip up there. They were scheduled to play St. Ignatius of San Francisco and got all the way to San Francisco and found out the night before that game wasn't happening. I don't know all the details, but somehow St. Ignatius had to cancel that game. I heard something about disciplinary reasons for their team, but the Foothill team is touring San Francisco, enjoying a road trip. And the rug gets pulled out from under them. So they managed to scramble and get a game with Sacred Heart down in Atherton on the peninsula that they ended up winning by 1. I want to say it was 8-7. I didn't look up that score. So that was a surprise opponent, no preparation, and thankfully, a strong team was able to schedule in a last-minute game against another strong team, and willing to take on another strong team on a moment's notice. So Foothill won that one, and then went across the bay to San Ramon Valley and Danville and suffered their first loss, which is no shame. San Ramon Valley is one of the best teams in Northern California and probably the state over the last few years. And then they came back. Foothill came back, and Monday beat San Clemente. Now we still have San Clemente in the rankings. In fact, they moved up from 10 to 9. But we've been talking in the last few weeks that San Clemente hadn't truly been tested, and they hadn't played enough games to really warrant moving up any higher in the rankings. But they acquitted themselves nicely against Foothill. I believe that one was tied at the half, and I think a 3-goal game heading into the fourth quarter. And then Foothill pulled away. Now, You can argue, as I think Foothill's Twitter account did, that they just played a really lousy first half coming off of the Easter weekend and their trip to San Francisco, and they finally put it together in the second half. Or you can argue that San Clemente is actually pretty good and played them really tough for 2 or 3 quarters before Foothill pulled away in that one. So that really cements Foothill in our number 1 spot. Only 1 loss to a strong out of area opponent, and then beating a pretty strong Orange County opponent. So, and then San Clemente, they lost previous in the week to Palo Verde of Nevada. We talked about them last week, coming in to play Palos Verdes, a game that Palos Verdes won. Palo Verde stuck around and played San Clemente and beat San Clemente. So San Clemente's resume is starting to take shape. You know, the only 2 losses and 2 pretty good teams, but they lost to a team that Palos Verdes at 5 has beaten. So it sort of follows that they're right there in the bottom half of the top 10.
Last week we proposed the question, can someone beat Foothill? And I remember you saying, yeah, they may have to drive 5 hours to have it done though. But as you mentioned, no shame, because San Ramon Valley is a powerhouse up in Northern Cal. Also, Jim, I did notice we have a few teams on the bubble, Santa Margarita being one of them. And I noticed that they have 11 games in April after playing only 6 in March. So do you think there's potential for them to move up into the top 10 then?
I think there is. I hadn't really looked at their schedule that closely before and realized how backloaded it was. And I think they were 3-3 through March, and then they beat Amador Valley of Pleasanton, another NorCal team, yesterday, I believe that was, or Monday. But then you look ahead, and there's 11 more games and 11 more opportunities to improve that resume. So very, very good chance. We know that team is loaded with talent, so a real good chance for them to move up. And the other interesting thing about a couple teams that we have on our bubble, we talked a little bit about Agoura last week. They had beaten Westlake last night. Oak Park actually beat Agoura 8-7 in what sounded like just a really tight game. I think Oak Park led by maybe as many as 3, or might have only been 2, but it was back and forth the whole way. And Agoura had possession with a man up in the final minute, looking to tie for overtime, and turned it over. Oak Park cleared it and ran out the clock. But you have Oak Park, Agoura, and then at number 10 we have Oaks Christian, which also lost to Oak Park. So we're into that time of year where a lot of teams that are in our rankings have played and beaten each other. So sort of adjusting things bit by bit to figure out who deserves to be ranked above another based on one loss or one win here or there. And these games are tight too. I mean, 8-7 game in lacrosse is pretty impressive.
Absolutely. We'll keep our rankings going with our girls' top 10, and as the graphic comes up, you can see at number 10 we have San Clemente, 9 Aliso Niguel, 8 Trabuco Hills, 7 San Juan Hills, 6 Santa Margarita, 5 Redondo Union, 4 Palos Verdes, 3 we have Mater Dei, 2 Foothill, and still at number 1 we have St. Margaret's. So let's kind of work through this top 10 as well. We had our number 1 team still remaining our number 1 team as they beat Santa Margarita. But Jim, what are your biggest takeaways from this week's girls top 10?
Well, the biggest takeaway actually comes down at the bottom of the rankings. The only changes in the first 6 were Palos Verdes jumping ahead of Redondo. So 4 and 5 flip-flopped because Palos Verdes has a head-to-head win now over Redondo last week. In the Bay League. But when you get, then we see San Juan Hills unranked up till now, and that may be an oversight on our part, but suddenly they're at 6 and 4. We have to jump them in at number 7 because they beat Trabuco Hills, which we had at number 7. So then how far does Trabuco Hills fall? Well, they have a win on their resume against Aliso Niguel, so we can't put them behind Aliso. And Aliso has a win over Los Alamitos, and I believe also won over San Clemente. So the bottom 4 or 5 spots in that in the girls' top 10 really comes down to some head-to-head results, and how much do you value those head-to-head results versus the overall body of work. And we talked about that a little bit, I think, in the boys last week. Is an early loss, is that forgivable a few weeks later when the team has grown and evolved and maybe is playing better? But right now we're looking at San Juan, Trabuco, Aliso, and San Clemente, with Los Al sitting on the bubble. And then a couple of teams from up our way in LA, Oak Park, Chaminade, Westlake, as potential teams that could creep into the bottom half of those rankings down the road.
You mentioned Los Al. They beat Newport Harbor, but they lost to Tesoro. So we'll see if they can creep back up because, as you mentioned, they are sitting on the bubble there. Top 10's crowded as usual. Everyone's trying to sneak on in. Let's transition our attention now to game balls before we preview what's to come. Let's keep kind of reflecting on last week and award our boys and girls game balls. Let's start with our boys this week, Jim.
Sure. Tesoro, I believe, might be the only undefeated team left, or at least the only ranked or playoff caliber undefeated team, and they're 10-0. Last week they beat Mission Viejo and then beat Corona del Mar, and from what I understand, that was the first time in the program's history that Tesoro has beaten Corona del Mar. And so two guys out of that game off the Tesoro roster jumped out. Junior Carson Spooner and senior Jason Moretta. Both had good games there and good weeks. Spooner had 2 goals and 3 assists against Corona del Mar and 4 goals and an assist in a win over Mission Viejo. The senior Moretta had 3 goals, 2 assists against CDM and 4 goals, 1 assist over Mission Viejo. So solid weeks for both of them on the offensive side.
Congratulations to those guys.
And then another standout of the week was face-off specialist Stuart Pollard of St. Margaret's, who went 13 of 17 against Yorba Linda, and perhaps even more impressively, 18 of 20 in a win over Poway. Continuing to give the Tartans the ball and giving that offense opportunities, and continuing, as they remain undefeated. Well, there you go. Tesoro's not the only undefeated. 2 spots ahead of them, we have St. Margaret's.
Congratulations, Carson Spooner, Jason Moretta, and Stuart Pollard. Let's head on to the girls' side of things, Jim.
Sure. A really, really interesting story, game that we covered and have a recap up on Max Lax OC. Trabuco Hills in a triple overtime victory over Newport Harbor, 14-13. Hennessy Evans Jr. Scored 7 goals and had 3 assists in that game, and that 7th goal of hers was the game winner in the 3rd overtime. So good for her. Got a shout out to her. And then Kelly Hoyt gets another one of our game balls. She is a junior at Palos Verdes. In that win over Redondo that we mentioned earlier, she had 4 goals, 2 interceptions for takeaways, and then controlled 8 draws in that game, as the Sea Kings really just, I think, kept the ball away from Redondo and controlled the tempo much of the time.
Congratulations to Hennessy Evans and Kelly Hoyt, all of those game ball recipients, certainly deserving. So now, Jim, we've kind of looked back, we've reflected, gone through everything. Let's look ahead and preview what's to come, because it's a big week, especially for Loyola and Harvard Westlake, and Foothill and San Clemente, all teams that we've talked about. But talk about why it's such a big week.
Sure. So we mentioned Loyola. They opened their week last night with the win at Coronado. But coming up, they have a game, in fact, this afternoon or this evening against St. Ignatius of Cleveland. Now, it's Ohio. We don't know a whole lot about them from out here. But what we found out with a quick glance was SI from Cleveland actually also beat Coronado over the weekend, and then turned around and lost to Torrey Pines, but only by a goal, 8-7. Wow. So this should be a real good test. Sounds like it's a pretty good team coming in to face Loyola. which, if you look at their schedule, they're pretty much playing anybody, no matter how highly ranked or highly regarded. Loyola schedule is as tough as they can. And then later on in the week, Poway, Saturday, Poway comes up to play Loyola. So Coronado, SI of Cleveland, and Poway all in the same week. A big week for Loyola, which has the really strong resume, as we mentioned. But this is really going to cement them if they're able to pull off a couple of more wins this week.
Absolutely. Let's take a look at the girls' side of things. What are a few games that you think people should be watching for? St.
Margaret's, we have them number one. They head up to Northern California to play Novato, which is north of San Francisco. Right. The Hornets, the Novato Hornets, are 8-1 this year. And like we did with SI of Cleveland, we wanted to look back and say, well, what is this program? Is that a fluke? It's not a fluke. The Hornets are 57-2 over the last two and a half seasons. They were 25-1 last year and 24-0 the year before. So 8-1 this year is no surprise. So this will be a huge test for St. Margaret's to see how they stack up against a team with that kind of track record over the last few years.
Right.
So that's the game that really jumped out at me. There's a few others on both the boys' side and the girls that are worth paying attention to, but we're still in a little bit of that spring break period where some teams are back and playing league games that sometimes are good matchups, sometimes not, and other teams are either still on break or are entertaining teams from out of town who are on break, and so that's where we get the SI Cleveland and a few others coming to town. So. Absolutely.
So still a little bit quiet because of that spring break, but certainly opportunities to shake up the top 10 per usual. And I also noticed that on the girls' side of things, Santa Margarita is traveling down to San Diego to play Cathedral Catholic. Do you know anything about that San Diego Cathedral Catholic team? I know that they're a powerhouse in other sports, but...
Yeah, their boys lacrosse team is usually pretty good. I think they might be a little bit down this year, just looking at trying to remember some of the scores that I've seen come in. But I haven't really looked them up. But so there's that game for Santa Margarita. And then looking ahead to early next week, Santa Margarita is at Foothill. So that'll be another interesting one. We have Santa Margarita at number 6 and Foothill number 2. So that'll be a big game in our rankings going into early next week.
Well, we're excited for that, and that's all we have for you guys for this installment of our Laxcast. But per usual, Jim and I, we love to hear from you. So if you have any game ball recipients that you feel are deserving of game ball outstanding performances, we want to hear from you. Tweet us, or you can leave comments in the comment section below. Best way to get a hold of us on Twitter, my name is at Sarah J. Chafee, and then Jim's is at J. Lofty. Correct, Jim?
That's correct. I'm also at MaxLaxLA, so you can find me either place. And we'd love to hear from you. I don't know that we heard from anybody this week. The week before, we got a few good game ball nominees. But let us know what you're thinking about the rankings, about deserving players deserving of some recognition, and let us know what you think of the podcast.
Yes, and maybe people are still on spring break and they're checked out. That's awesome. Well, Jim, and for all things lacrosse, if they want to read back on some games you had mentioned, or Hennessy, there was a recap of her excellent game. How can they do so?
Well, we're easy to find on the web, maxlaxoc.com. You can get straight to the LA section by typing in maxlaxla.com. As many people know, MaxLax, we've switched to a subscription model, a membership model to try to engage the Lax community and keep us going. And we've used the revenue to hire a couple of young writers in the Orange County area who are helping us to get out to more games so we can have more game recaps and we can come up with more Game Ball nominees. Hennessy Evans, in fact, was sent to me by our writer who was at that game. So the more people who join up with MaxLax, the more we can get out and about and provide more coverage and really try to bring this lacrosse community together.
Absolutely. We love what you're doing over there. Thank you so much, Jim. I look forward to talking to you next week. We'll be talking game balls, top 10, storylines, and previewing the week ahead. So we'll see you then. And thanks again, Jim.
All right. Thank you. See you next week.